The radar screen flickered to life. At first, it showed only open ocean, peaceful, empty. But then it registered movement, a tightly packed flotilla of Iranian fast attack boats, emerging from the haze like angry hornets. They were converging on a U.S. Navy supply convoy, naval guns poised, engines roaring. This was not a drill. This was a covert sea assault. The U.S. ships under orders patrolling international waters instantly recognized a threat. Within minutes, the ocean turned into a lethal kill zone. The lead supply ship sounded the alarm. On deck, sailors braced for impact as the destroyers in the convoy surged into defensive formation. From the carrier overhead, F/A-18s screamed in. The first helicopter gunships dipped low, their rotors chopping the sky. In seconds, the sea around them erupted in flares, missile trails, and deafening cannon fire. This level of coordinated precision wasn't fiction, it echoed history. In April 1988, the U.S. launched Operation Praying Mantis, a forceful response to an Iranian mine strike on USS Samuel B. Roberts. Within hours, a sweeping American counterattack had shattered Iranian naval assets, oil platforms, frigates, speedboats, all reduced to burning wreckage. Wikipedia. The national interest now. Decades later, the same doctrine played out. Overwhelming force, electronic superiority, precise targeting, all unleashed faster than the enemy could react. The convoy's escorts executed a textbook kill-box maneuver, centering fire, sealing escape routes, and denying the attackers any room to breathe. Amid the chaos, one Iranian fast attack craft broke formation and charged directly, guns blazing. A Marine AH-1Z Viper wheeled into view from the carrier, its guns erupting into slugs of fire that carved through the boat in a burst of steel and fire. Another skiff tried a flank, but to Sea Sparrow missiles streaked across the water, slamming into engines and reducing the boat to debris. But the sea assault wasn't the only front. Below the waves, a sonar ping cut through the noise. A submarine, coupled with the surface assault, had crept into striking range. The escorts launched torpedoes in perfect sync with airstrikes above. Within 6 minutes total, the flotilla was shredded. The ocean was a roiling inferno. Political objectives were not fulfilled, they were obliterated. The once secret strike had destroyed everything before the attackers could even comprehend how fast they'd been outmatched. And just when the dust settled and you thought it was over, something unexpected appeared on the horizon. The horizon shimmered in the heat haze. But this was no mirage. Through binoculars, the watch officer spotted them: 3 more vessels, larger than the speedboats, but smaller than a frigate, emerging from behind a cluster of fishing dhows. Their silhouettes were unmistakable. Iranian missile boats, each bristling with launch tubes. The Navy's Combat Information Center instantly lit up with chatter. These weren't survivors limping away, this was a second strike group, positioned to hit, while U.S. assets were still engaged with the debris field. Whoever was commanding them was gambling that the chaos of the first assault had drained the Americans' response capability. They were wrong. The carrier's airborne redirected to F/A-18 Super Hornets already airborne, their afterburners flaring as they banked hard toward the new contacts. At the same time, the destroyer's Aegis system began feeding firing solutions to the entire task force. The kill box widened. Every U.S. platform, from the patrol helicopter hovering at sea level to the E-2 Hawkeye circling high above, locked into the network, turning the battle into a synchronized hunt. But these missile boats weren't charging in recklessly. They slowed, weaving between civilian traffic, using the dhows as cover, forcing U.S. targeting systems to separate hostile signatures from innocent vessels. It was a calculated attempt to exploit the Americans' rules of engagement. The tension on the bridge thickened. The clock was ticking. If the Iranians got within their optimum firing range, the convoy could be facing a wall of incoming anti-ship missiles. Then, without warning, the first enemy boat lit off its radar, broadcasting its targeting signal like a flare in the night. It was the cue the U.S. had been waiting for. The destroyer's vertical launch cells cracked open, belching smoke as 2 SM-2 missiles streaked skyward. They arced over the waves before plunging down toward the missile boat, detonating in a blinding white flash. The second Iranian craft broke away, gunning for open water, but the Super Hornet swooped in, releasing precision-guided bombs that turned its aft deck into molten wreckage. Only one boat remained, and it wasn't running. It was holding position, unmoving, as though waiting for something. On the Navy's sonar screens, the reason became clear, a faint, low-frequency signature rising from beneath the waves. It wasn't just another ship. It was a submarine. The sonar operator's voice cut through the combat chatter, steady but urgent. Contact confirmed. Bearing 085, closing fast. Estimated depth 70 meters. Possible Kilo-class submarine. The bridge crew exchanged quick, knowing glances. A Kilo-class was no joke stealthy. Diesel-electric, designed to slip past advanced detection. In these waters, it could launch heavyweight torpedoes or even anti-ship cruise missiles before anyone had time to react. The task force commander didn't hesitate. All units, shift to anti-sub warfare protocols. Maintain kill box perimeter. Vipers, clear the airspace for dipping sonar ops. Let's find her before she finds us. Almost immediately, two MH-6R Seahawks broke off from escort duty and banked low over the water, their rotors chopping salt spray into mist. Within seconds, they dropped their dipping sonar arrays, sending electronic pings pulsing through the depths. The sub responded by cutting speed, trying to blend with the seafloor's thermal layers, but every evasive maneuver left a signature, and the Americans tracked each ripple of sound like a predator following a wounded target. Then came the telltale sound: compressed gas and a metallic click. Torpedo in the water. Repeat, torpedo in the water. The nearest supply ships swung hard to port, countermeasure launchers spitting decoy flares and noisemakers into the sea. The torpedoes swerved, chasing the false echoes, buying precious seconds. The destroyer's sonar team fed coordinates to the Seahawks. One MH-6R dropped a Mark 54 lightweight torpedo into the suspected intercept path. Beneath the waves, the weapon armed itself, homing in on the faint thrum of the sub's propellers. There was a muffled boom, more felt than heard, followed by a spreading plume of oil surfacing like a dark bloom. But the sonar still showed intermittent movement, crippled or not. The submarine was trying to limp away. Negative kill confirmation, the ASW officer muttered. She's hurt, but she's still in the fight. The commander leaned over the chart table, studying the sub's trajectory. It was heading toward a narrow channel, shallower waters that could limit US maneuverability and mask the sub's escape. Not happening, he said coldly. Close the gate. Box her in. As the US ships began tightening their formation, the second Seahawk prepared for another strike run. But before it could deploy, a sudden comm burst filled the CIC encrypted chatter, intercepted from the Iranian command net. It wasn't just one submarine, there were two. The realization hit like a cold wave. Two submarines meant to attack vectors, one to distract, the other to kill. Second contact bearing 160, depth 90 meters, the sonar operator reported, his voice tight. She's moving fast, too fast for silent running. That speed meant one thing: an attack run. The task force's formation shifted instantly. The destroyer USS Higgins broke off to shadow the crippled Kilo class, while the cruiser USS Antietam pivoted south to intercept the fast mover. Overhead, the Eta Hawkeye widened its radar sweep, hunting for any periscope wake or launch plume that might betray the second sub's position. But this one was smart. It was weaving through the undersea thermocline's temperature layers that bent sonar pings and created false targets. Every few seconds, the contact flickered, vanished, then reappeared, like a ghost slipping through walls. Deploy Sonobuoy Field, Pattern Delta 3, the ASW commander ordered. Within moments, the Seahawks began peppering the water with floating sensors, each one chirping back real-time data. Slowly, a picture emerged. This sub wasn't angling for the escorts. It was aiming for the supply ship, the heart of the convoy. The commander's voice was razor-sharp over comms. All units, priority target shift. Protect the resupply vessel at all costs. The destroyer launched another pair of Mark 54 torpedoes in a crisscross intercept. The sub countered by ejecting decoys, bubbling clouds that shimmered with metallic foil to confuse homing systems. One torpedo bit on a decoy and detonated harmlessly. The other kept tracking, then went silent, lost lock, the weapons officer muttered. Then the sonar picked up something even worse, the unmistakable metallic rattle of torpedo tubes flooding. Incoming multiple launches, a klaxon blared. The Antietam fired off anti-torpedo countermeasures, while the Seahawks dove low for a clear drop zone. Depth charges splashed in quick succession, thundering underwater. 2 of the Iranian torpedoes were spoofed and diverted, but one kept closing in straight toward the supply ship. The ship's captain ordered an emergency turn, the hull groaning under the strain as chaff and noisemakers streamed into the sea. The torpedo veered slightly, but not enough. 50 yards, 40, 30, and then another explosion tore through the deep, not from the torpedo hitting its mark, but from somewhere beneath it. The shockwave bucked the supply ship sideways. When the sonar feed cleared, the incoming torpedo was gone. In its place, rising from the depths, was a jagged column of bubbles and a widening oil slick. One of the subs had just been destroyed. But the crippled Kilo was still out there, and now it was making a desperate surface run toward the Iranian coastline. The Kilo-class submarine broke the surface in a violent surge, its conning tower slick with seawater and smoke. From the bridge of the USS Higgins, binoculars locked onto it instantly. "She's surfacing to run the gauntlet," the XO muttered, and he was right by surfacing. The sub traded stealth for speed. In shallow coastal waters, it could outrun pursuing torpedoes and possibly slip into territorial limits where US forces would be forced to disengage. The order came quick: all assets intercept before the 12-mile line. "This is our last window." The Seahawks immediately swung into pursuit, skimming low over the waves, their rotors kicking up a rolling mist. The FA-18s overhead dipped into attack patterns, while the destroyer's forward deck guns began spitting bursts across the water surface, bracketing the fleeing vessel with deadly precision. But the Iranian captain wasn't done fighting. Crew members scrambled onto the sub's deck, setting up a man-portable missile launcher. The bright flare of ignition, the morning haze, and anti-air missile streaking toward the lead Seahawk. The pilot threw the helicopter into a violent evasive brake, countermeasure flares streaking past the cockpit as the missile arced harmlessly into the sea. The near hit only hardened the resolve of the task force. The Antietam's main gun roared, a 5-inch shell smashing into the ocean just meters off the Kilo's bow, drenching its crew in spray. But instead of surrendering, the sub kept gunning east, its wake foaming white. "Range to coastal boundary 8 miles, the navigator called out. The clock was bleeding down. The Carrier Strike Group S Air Wing was now fully in the fight to Super Hornet streaked in low, their targeting pods locked on the fleeing sub. At the same time, a P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft, circling high above, fed live targeting coordinates to every ship and aircraft in the network. The Iranian captain, realizing the noose was closing, tried a last gambit, swinging his vessel toward a cluster of civilian fishing boats, hoping to use them as cover. The maneuver forced the US gunners to hold fire for a split second, just long enough for the Kilo to close the gap toward safety. 7 miles, 6. Then, from the Poseidon's feed, a new contact appeared, fast moving, skimming just beneath the waves, coming straight toward the sub from the east. It wasn't American, and it wasn't civilian. The unidentified contact cut through the water like a knife, leaving a thin, foaming trail barely visible from the air. The P-8 Poseidon's sensor operator zoomed in, isolating its signature. The shape was small, fast, and riding low, too big for a torpedo, too small for a conventional patrol craft. Reading matches and manned surface vessel, possible explosive payload. The CIC went silent for a beat, An unmanned explosive drone boat. This was a new card in Iran's playbook, and it was heading straight for the surfaced Kilo-class sub. The USS Higgins captain narrowed his eyes. Is it hostile to us, or them? That was the question. The drone was coming from the east closer to Iranian territorial waters. Logic suggested it was an asset deployed to protect the sub, but the Poseidon SV told a different story. Its guidance path was locked directly on the Kilo, not the US ships. In the Seahawk's cockpit, the pilot watched a strange, darting vessel closing in. Sir, I don't think that's one of theirs. The drone hit 40 knots, skipping over the swells, a thin rooster tail flaring behind it. The Iranian crew spotted it. 2 men scrambled on deck, shouting. One even firing bursts from an AK across the water. The rounds skipped harmlessly off the surface, never slowing the craft. Range closing 200 meters. In the CIC, the US commander made the call. Maintain hold fire. Repeat. Do not engage. This wasn't their fight. For the next few seconds it was about to be between the Kilo and whatever entity had just decided to intervene. The drone slammed into the Kilo's port side just aft of the conning tower. The explosion wasn't massive, nothing like a torpedo, but it tore open a gash above the waterline, sending steel plates outward and knocking crew into the sea. Smoke and seawater mixed in a violent spray. The sub began to list. It still had propulsion, but now it was leaking badly, and the fishing boats it had hoped to hide among scattered in panic. The US commander's voice came low and deliberate over the comms. Whoever just hit them isn't here to help us, or them. Find that control signal. Signals intelligence officers jumped on the task, triangulating the source of the drone's guidance. The first pings came back within seconds, originating from deep inland, far beyond the Iranian coastline, and it wasn't Iran. The SIGINT station's displays lit up with location data, the lines on the map converging far from any Iranian naval base. Coordinates lock, signals bouncing through multiple relays, the chief analyst said, her voice taut. But origin appears to be Musandam Peninsula, Oman. That made no sense. Oman wasn't a hostile actor in this theater, at least not officially. The officers in the Combat Information Center exchanged quick, uneasy glances. The USS Higgins captain leaned over the console. Who's operating out of there? No one answered right away, but the analyst zoomed in on satellite imagery. Nestled in a rocky cove along the peninsula's jagged coastline sat a camouflaged vessel, small, low profile, and bristling with antenna arrays. It was the kind of craft used by private military contractors or intelligence operatives, not a conventional navy. This isn't a state navy, the intelligence officer finally said. This is a black flag operation. The implication sank in. Someone, somewhere, wanted that Iranian sub neutralized, but they didn't want their fingerprints on the job. On the water, the crippled Kilo class was still pushing forward, its engines straining, the deck partially awash. Another plume of smoke erupted from the damaged hull, likely from a fire below decks, but instead of limping toward Iranian territorial safety, it began a slow, unexpected turn, angling southeast, away from the coast. They're changing course, the navigator reported. Looks like they're heading straight for the cove on Musandam. It was insane. If the Oman-based operators had just attacked them, why sail toward them? Unless, the US commander narrowed his eyes. Unless they're not running from them, they're running to them. On the horizon, the Seahawk crew spotted more activity, to rigid hull boats launching from the camouflaged cove, racing out to meet the damaged sub. Whatever this was, it was coordinated. The carrier strike group faced a decision: pursue into Oman waters and risk a diplomatic firestorm, or shadow the unfolding operation and find out who was bold enough to play both sides in a high-stakes naval war zone. The admiral's voice came over secure comms, firm and cold. Maintain shadow. No engagement unless fired upon. I want eyes on everything. And so the chase continued, this time not just against a known adversary, but toward an unknown, invisible power pulling strings from the shadows. The rigid hull boats closed in fast, their dark hulls slicing through the choppy waters. From the Sea Hawk above, the view was unmistakable. These weren't ordinary rescue craft. They were heavily armed, their decks lined with men in tactical gear, faces masked, weapons slung across their chests. As they reached the listing Kilo-class sub, a frenzy of activity erupted. The operatives scrambled aboard, moving with military precision. They ignored the wounded Iranian sailors, heading straight for the aft hatch. Within minutes, they emerged carrying large, sealed containers, each the size of a small coffin, each marked with no flag, no symbols, just matte black paint. The U.S. task force watched through optics and camera feeds, powerless to intervene without breaching Omani territorial sovereignty. The containers were transferred to the rigid hull boats, which immediately peeled away from the crippled sub and darted back toward the hidden cove. The Iranian crew, now abandoned, tried to stabilize their vessel, but it was too late. Water flooded through the damaged hull, the bow lifting high before the sub slid under with a groan of twisting steel, leaving only oil and debris in its wake. On board the USS Higgins, the operations officer broke the silence. "Admiral, our sergeant confirms the black flag vessel is powering down comms. Whoever they are, they're going dark." The admiral stared at the feed for a long moment. "Copy that. Mark the cove, mark the boats, and tag every piece of intel we've got. This isn't over." As the strike group withdrew to international waters, the truth settled over the crew like a cold weight. This battle had been just the surface of something far deeper. Somewhere in that rocky Omani cove, in those unmarked black containers, lay the real reason for the sub's mission, the drone strike, and the entire covert operation. And now, the only people who knew what was inside were the ones who had vanished without a trace.